Welcome everyone to today's webcast on the KTER Center's efforts to improve vocational rehabilitation services for people with autism spectrum disorder, which will be presented by my colleague Elizabeth Frenzel. I'm Ann Outlaw from the American Institutes for Research, or AIR, and this webcast is part of a four-part series on the KTER Center's research activities and resources. This webcast is offered through the Center on Knowledge Translation for Employment Research, or the KTER Center, which is funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, or NIDLR. We have information that accompanies today's webcast on our website, and this includes a PowerPoint file and a text description of the training material, as well as links to the other webcasts in this series. Before we dive into the webcast today, I'd like to give a brief overview of the KTER Center's purpose and activities. We're here to test knowledge translation strategies to help others find, use, and understand research to ultimately help people with disabilities find and keep their jobs. We have a variety of research and dissemination activities. We try to identify findings related to improving employment outcomes among individuals with disabilities. We also help to determine what needs for research-based information are most pressing to our stakeholders. And thirdly, we investigate and test knowledge translation strategies that can increase these stakeholders' appropriate use of identified research findings that meet their reported needs. We aim to widely share our project findings and to provide technical assistance to researchers to support application of their work, while also promoting collaboration among NIDLR-funded researchers working in the employment field and between these researchers and their stakeholder audiences that can benefit from the use of these research findings. You can hear more about these activities in the other webcasts in the series or by visiting our website at kter.org. Today, Elizabeth, the KTER Center Research Director, will be talking about the findings from the focus groups we conducted with people with autism spectrum disorder and how that information will be used. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me, Elizabeth.
Well, you're welcome.
So to get us going, can you tell us why you conducted these focus groups?
Yeah, we conducted the focus groups as a starting point for a larger research study that is discussed by Kathleen Murphy on a separate webisode. In the larger study, we're going to train VR supervisors or managers about social and communication skills for individuals with autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. And ASD is a really large topic, and we wanted our work to be person-centered. So for the study, we needed to understand what was most important to adults with ASD and their VR counselors. That way, we would know what topics to focus on to create the training. We wanted to make sure what we selected available research would be relevant to what people wanted and needed to know.
Why the interest in person-centered, and what does that actually mean?
In this case, a person-centered approach means focusing on what matters most to the individuals with ASD seeking employment and their VR counselors. So rather than a researcher-centered or what is important to researchers, we wanted to focus on what is important to the individuals who will use the information. And in the past, some research studies, researchers would identify a specific issue that was important to the researchers, but may not have always been important to the people being studied. So in this case, we conducted the focus groups to identify specific issues that are important for training VR supervisors to, in turn, train their staff. The researchers identified the general topic of ASD in the vocational rehab world because both NIDLR had already invested in projects on ASD and because individuals with ASD and the VR counselors identified the topic as important to them.
So tell us a little bit more about the reason you did the focus groups.
The purpose of the research really starts with this idea of bridging the gap between research and practice in a way that enables VR supervisors to help their staff to use research to better assist people with ASD to find and maintain employment. And to do that, we not only need to know what VR staff in the field are doing in terms of best practice, but also the challenges individuals with ASD face and what they would like to see more of in terms of support. So these focus groups really gave us the opportunity to do just that.
Can you tell everyone why it might be important to focus on employment for individuals with autism spectrum disorder?
Absolutely. Autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, describes a group of developmental disorders. People with ASD often find it difficult to communicate, interact, and engage socially with others. They also tend to have narrow interests and repetitive behaviors. Typically, parents may see symptoms within the first few years of a child's life, and the symptoms are ongoing. Common issues for people with ASD include sensory issues such as being extra sensitive to smells, lights, or how things feel. And these symptoms and levels of severity vary widely. So when looking for a job, adults with ASD may have challenges with social skills or communicating verbally. They may also be extremely focused. And focus is great, but sometimes people with ASD are so focused it's detrimental to being able to do their job.
Interesting. So who was involved in these focus groups?
In December 2016, we conducted 2 phone-based focus groups, one with 5 VR counselors and a second focus group with 5 adults with autism spectrum disorder. In the focus group with people with ASD, 4 of the adults participated on the telephone, and one of the individuals wrote responses to the questions asked during the focus group. All of them worked with VR counselors.
Tell me a little bit more about the focus groups. What did you discuss during the focus groups?
For the focus groups of adults with ASD, we asked about what challenges they and other people with ASD have when finding and holding jobs, what services VR counselors can provide, and what training VR counselors and employers need. The focus group of VR counselors addresses the services, training, and resources that could enhance the services that the counselors provide to adults with ASD. So in essence, we covered the same topics across both focus groups, but framed them somewhat differently.
Elizabeth, those are interesting topics. For the adults with ASD, what perspectives did they share?
First, given the great variation in how ASD is experienced, the main finding of this focus group was the need to understand that people with ASD have unique interests, goals, and capabilities. If you meet one person with ASD, you have met one person with ASD. And similarly, there is no one-size-fits-all job. Second, and related to this, focus group participants with ASD reported feeling stereotyped into specific roles, typically computer or numbers types of roles, when VR counselor attempted to place them in jobs. According to most of the participants in this focus group, VR counselors generally believe that people with ASD prefer computer jobs. Participants felt that this limited view underserves many people with ASD.
So it seems like it's important for VR staff to avoid pigeonholing or being too narrow in how they think about job placement for people with autism. Is there anything else that was helpful for individuals with ASD?
I would say yes, definitely. The focus group members with ASD said that they had challenges with communications, understanding and filling out applications, and interviewing. For example, individuals with ASD stated that they really didn't know how to fill out an application and needed guidance. Communication skills, particularly during an interview, were also identified as a need. For example, what is typically asked in an interview and common responses, including standard pleasantries such as hello and goodbye, nice to meet you, and thank you. By understanding these types of challenges for people with ASD, VR counselors can better support them to manage these common frustrations associated with finding work. And adults with ASD in this focus group reported that they knew other adults with ASD whose counselors seemed pressured to fill a position and claim a success, rather than target employment that was a good fit and would last beyond 90 days. What that means is, yes, someone would get a job, but the individual might not like it and couldn't really do the job and would leave right after the 90 days were completed. And so without using the term supported employment, focus group members requested this type of approach. They indicated it would be helpful to have an advocate, a counselor, or an ASD specialist who could advise employers whenever an issue arises. A person in such a role could explain personal expressions of autism spectrum disorder, for example, self-stimulation, and educate employers, protecting the person with ASD from feelings of embarrassment or being ostracized. The focus group participants also suggested it would be helpful to discuss with VR counselors how they should disclose their ASD status to the employer. Some believe they would be treated differently in some circumstances, but it could be beneficial at other times. Disclosure may justify the use of specific equipment such as communication technology. Adults with ASD in the focus group reported success when their bosses and coworkers understood idiosyncrasies with how people experience ASD. The adults advocated that VR counselors should talk with potential employers about the strengths and weaknesses of a person with ASD. Certain personal traits may be an asset in the right workplace. They also recommended that human resources departments contact organizations or programs such as the Job Accommodation Network that can provide resources and support for accommodating people with ASD or other disabilities.
Elizabeth, while the number of people in the group was small, they arrived at terrific recommendations. Do you think this is reflective of the larger population of individuals with ASD?
You know, that's a great question, Anne. What we heard is not likely that everyone with ASD would share, nor is it intended to be. The purpose of this research was to obtain a depth and breadth of responses, not to be statistically representative. In addition, the participants were self-selected, so these are individuals who communicate well and are comfortable communicating and are likely more independent. We might have had very different findings if we had a large random sample of people focused on individuals with verbal challenges or who were less independent. These participants also reported that they identified and obtained employment independently, and most of them had more success finding jobs on their own rather than through VR services. Some of the participants even stated they found jobs in part because their VR counselors did not find them employment that matched their interests or capabilities.
Well, that is very interesting to hear the perspectives of adults with ASD and their experiences receiving VR services and obtaining a job. Then what about the VR counselors? What did you hear from them?
Well, it was very thought-provoking because while the counselors involved in the focus group did not work with any of the individuals with ASD in the focus group, there were some similarities.
That piques my interest. What do you mean?
So one of the key similarities is that the counselors felt it was critical to treat each person individually and avoid generalizations. So for example, VR counselors pointed out that understanding the strengths and weaknesses of the individuals with ASD that they serve allows them to identify a job that is a good fit. Careful thought about an individual's capacities and interests allows a VR counselor to better tailor a job search and develop workplace strategies that are intrinsically motivating.
So, Elizabeth, if the participants agreed that each person with ASD needs individualized support, what is the takeaway from the two focus groups?
I would say that across the groups, VR counselors consistently agreed with the concerns expressed by the adults with ASD who had received VR services, even when those concerns reflected somewhat negatively on the VR system. VR counselors expressed that they do not always have time to implement what they know, and this limitation may be related to constraints that agencies also face where resources are stretched thin. And one possible reason for this apparent contradiction between services that people with ASD get and the knowledge of the VR counselors who provide services is that some of the VR counselors in this focus group had more experience in VR service delivery, specifically for individuals with ASD, while the counselors who actually worked with the adults who participated in the focus groups may not have had that expertise.
So from these focus groups, what are the next steps?
Well, Anne, after the focus groups were held, we conducted a scoping review, which is a literature review that describes the landscape of available research relevant to improving social and communication skills for individuals with ASD. And using what we found through the scoping review process, we then developed a training program for VR supervisors. And our next step is to evaluate or test the training. And our goal is to train the VR supervisors on research that supports employment outcomes for people with ASD. And then to learn whether that helps connect to the day-to-day work of VR counselors to better help them succeed in making job placements that are a good fit for the individual with ASD.
Well, those sound like terrific next steps. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for taking the time to talk to me about these focus groups. For our audience, you can learn more about the focus group findings and the next steps by visiting the website at kter.org. As a reminder, this webisode is part of a series on the KTER Center activities. After you listen to all 4 webisodes in the series, please take time to fill out our brief evaluation, which will be emailed to everyone who registered, and you can also find it on our website. And finally, I'd like to thank our funding agency, the National Institute for Disability Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, for providing funding for this research webisode. Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
You're welcome.